My name is Anna Richards. I am one of the academic liaison librarians here at DMU, and I'm presenting today with my colleague Arena. I'll just let her introduce herself. You're on mute, Arena.
I am indeed. As it happens, good start. So I'm a senior lecturer in the Centre for Learning and Study Support, or CLASS.
Yeah, I think everyone already has, but if you could just make sure your mic is on mute as well before we start, just so we don't get any background interference or anything. If you, at any point you can't hear us clearly, or if things, audio drops out or anything like that, please do respond in the chat. Either myself or Arena will be monitoring that chat as we present. Okay, so as the title would suggest, this session is all about how we are working in the library to help develop students' critical thinking, and the work that we've been doing on that over the last, well, several years, but particularly in the last year and a half. So those of you who have not yet responded, the link for this, you should be able to click on the link on the screen, but the link is also in the chat. So if you could just have a quick look at our MS form and answer the first question that appears when you click on this link. We're just asking you, what aspects of critical thinking do you think your students struggle with the most, or do you think that they need the most to develop? Just so that we can get an idea as well of how everyone is kind of defining and thinking about critical thinking. So I'm just having a quick look at, I can see we've got some responses coming through already, so that's great. So yes, if you could all just have a quick look at that and respond as appropriate. One of the reasons why we're asking you, how do you define critical thinking? What do you think are the most important critical thinking skills your students need to develop? Is because it's actually quite difficult to adequately define critical thinking. You can look up critical thinking in a variety of different places, dictionaries, books, journal articles, and they all define it slightly differently. So here are just some of the definitions that I found as I was doing research on this. So, for example, it can be defined as the examination of an idea thoroughly rather than taking it at face value. Sometimes people define it more as a state of mind or a disposition. So a critical thinker thinks open-mindedly, they assess their assumptions and the implications of these, or maybe they have the propensity to engage in reflective skepticism. The OED defines it as the objective, systematic and rational analysis and evaluation of factual evidence in order to form a judgment. So we can see, even just, this is just 4 examples out of many, many ways that people define critical thinking. And this makes it quite difficult in some respects when it comes to us thinking about how we develop students as critical thinkers, because what they might think of critical thinking might be different from what we're intending as critical thinking, might be different from what your colleague thinks of as critical thinking. Sometimes as well, it's people define it more as specific skills. And I was reading research the other day that was suggesting that there might be a slight difference here in how academic staff define critical thinking and how students define critical thinking, in that their research suggested that sometimes academic staff think of critical thinking more as that kind of disposition, or more theoretically and overarching. Students think of it maybe more in terms of specific skills. So things like argument analysis, evaluating whether information is reliable or authoritative, understanding things like logical fallacies and cognitive biases that lead to flawed reasoning, how to interpret and understand statistics, how to apply and read information critically. So these are more concrete skills that might be a way of us also thinking about how we define critical thinking. So bearing this in mind, all of these different theories and definitions, how does this then relate to disruptive pedagogy? Because I was going to say, we are here under the Disruptive Pedagogy banner for today's conference. DMU defines it primarily in terms of technology and teaching delivery. And this is one way of thinking about disruptive pedagogy. But an alternative way is to consider disruptive pedagogy as a way to question the status quo and give students the skills to do this. So Felmeyer in 2018 argues for this definition, and she based her discussion on the kind of critical pedagogy work of people like Frere and Bell Hooks and James Baldwin, who argued that education's role is to help students become informed critical citizens, not only future workers. I've also seen disruptive pedagogy defined as creating self-directed learners that can ask the right question at the right time to affect change. So again, looking at this from a social informed citizenship idea of education, rather than just teaching concrete skills, perhaps to lead into a career. So with this definition, critical thinking and disruptive pedagogy go hand in hand. We're teaching students critical thinking skills. So we're teaching them to question things, to analyze arguments, and to challenge accepted narratives. And this could even lead them to, questioning accepted narratives in higher education as well. So in that respect, it can be very disruptive to think of critical thinking in this way. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Irina now.
So this interest in critical thinking at the level of research is, of course, reflected in the way in which you perceive critical thinking in pedagogical practice. And so one of the authors that Anna mentioned also was looking at the fact that critical thinking is in particular associated with Western higher education, is defined as the bedrock of higher education in Western countries, a higher level cognitive skill that is central to learning outcomes, teaching and assessment across all disciplines. It is also seen as a kind of transferable skill, so a key graduate attribute that can boost employability for students, but at the same time, it's been rated by organizations such as the Office for Students and similar organizations abroad as an essential component of what they call learning gain, and it's included as such in their metrics. In our kind of practical experience as members of the kind of learning services team at DMU, we've kind of had the same impression that critical thinking is seen by both academics and students as a high priority for them. All of the teams, so that includes CLASS, which focus on support with academic writing, MLC, which focus on support with maths and stats, and the librarians, who focus on the support with finding information and referencing, have engaged with dimensions of critical thinking relevant to their expertise in various interactions with students. For example, it's quite central, as I mentioned earlier, in faculty sessions through kind of interaction with the module leader and tutors, but also we chose it as a theme for our self-selecting workshops, and it quite often comes up in discussions with students as part of one-to-one tutorials. What we have not been able to do quite so well is kind of put our expertise together into one sort of comprehensive tool that takes students through the various skills and aspects of critical thinking. So to offer them kind of one comprehensive holistic view, if you want. For example, in CLASS, as I said, we offer critical thinking as a component of our workshops of quite a long time. Students are able to identify these workshops using the critical writing tag in our booking system. So what you see on the screen is an overview of what the booking system looks like for students. And examples of workshops touching upon this topic could be Introduction to Critical Thinking or Improving, Masterclass, which is offered in a particular workshop week that's targeted at postgraduate students, but also other workshops might touch upon criticality, for example, being original in your dissertation or in your assessment, using evidence in your writing, or developing an argument in your literature review or in your dissertation, etc. So if we have a look at the different tags or categories that we include over a year in our self-selecting open program workshops, you can perhaps find critical writing. It's about 6.7% of the total workshops we're offering. So it's not a huge amount. It's about 27 events overall, but they do attract a large number of registrations, about 90% of the total volume of registrations, which clearly shows there is a demand for this. And we often find that students are theoretically aware of the importance of being critical, but they still struggle with the practical aspects of it, or how to actually demonstrate that concretely in their writing, or how to transfer that from one type of assessment, one type of writing, or even one type of kind of presentation to another. So I'm just going to pass this back to Anna. Oh, sorry, you're muted. I think we've.
Even after all this time, even after almost a year now. So as I was just saying, as Irina said, that demand for the critical writing workshops shows that students recognise that need, but are still, struggling with applying these skills. And when we think back to all those different ways that you could define critical thinking, it's not really surprising that students might be feeling a bit overwhelmed or struggling to develop all of the skills that might encompass. And I was just having a quick look at some of the responses that you gave on that MS form, and again we can see a wide mix of different skills that you think students need to develop. That would be important for them to develop. So if we're thinking that, okay, they've got to be able to evaluate quality of information, understand confirmation bias, write critically, etc. So that's a lot of skills for students to have to develop. Critical writing is what we, what class we're kind of offering, and critical reading as well previously. But as Irina said, we didn't necessarily have a very collaborative or joined up approach or comprehensive approach to teaching critical thinking previously. So for example, like the liaison librarians could and did sometimes teach source evaluation, so looking at different sources of information and seeing whether they are reliable and authoritative. So we did sometimes teach this in curriculum teaching, but we didn't offer it as a workshop that students could book onto as part of the open programme. We had a matrix on the website, but not a lot of guidance around that to allow students to kind of use this as a self-directed learning resource. And actually recent research suggests that using this matrix approach, which is what we used to do, where you teach students an acronym or have a little matrix that they fill out and give points on certain criteria, recent research from the Stanford History Education Group and other researchers, so Caulfield 2018, for example, and there is a list of references at the end of this presentation, they argue that these approaches tend to be quite long-winded, so it requires students to kind of sit with every source of information and fill out this whole matrix, or kind of go through a list of questions, which they're not likely to do, and also that it kind of encourages students to focus on surface aspects, so the appearance of a website, for example, without giving them true insight into the authority and reliability of different sources of information. And even though we might talk to students about being careful about using websites, or telling them that they should only be using journal articles and academic books, we know from anecdotal experience that students still often go and use websites and include websites in their reference lists because they're easier to find, easier to read, but also I think we're often not necessarily teaching them the kind of pitfalls of using these sources of information. We're just kind of saying, well, you should be using academic sources, and so they don't necessarily understand those pitfalls. And of course, we have to think outside of academia as well. If we're thinking about teaching students life skills and skills that they will be able to apply in becoming informed citizens, then we need to take into account all the sources of information that they may come across in their everyday lives or once they are no longer students at university. So the image on screen is from Google's Ngram engine. I don't know if anyone else has ever come across this, but it's very interesting. You can see how use of language has changed over time. And so unsurprisingly, you can see that things like misinformation, fake news and disinformation have, particularly fake news, taken a steep rise in terms of use of these words in language. Research has shown that people share things on social media, news articles, etc., often without even reading them or even thinking about whether that information is true or backed up by evidence. And we may think that the skills we teach in higher education, sort of using academic research and using the best evidence, constructing a good argument in an essay, we might think that these skills will help students avoid pitfalls of misinformation and fake news. But unfortunately, research, again from the Stanford History Education Group, who've done a lot of research on this in the last few years, they actually think that in some respects, the emphasis in academic work of directing students always to go to academic sources of information, journal articles and books, actually contributes to a student's lack of evaluatory skills generally, because in a sense, we're saying you do not need to spend time evaluating the authority of these sources of information because that's already done for you by being an academic source of information. So you can just focus on an article and how that will help you to answer your assignment question. But once they're outside of academia and they're on social media or they're on the web, they don't have the skills to be able to see whether something is reliable or not, and they don't necessarily even consider to do that. They are just looking to see whether something will help answer their question or will chime with their thoughts already on a topic. So reading about this, doing this research made me think, okay, we need to do more in the library to help teach these critical thinking skills. And that started off the critical thinking project. So this was probably about a year and a half ago when this really started. And at the time, we were moving towards a more collaborative approach within library and learning services, where the different teams were working more closely together. So we started off the project with members from each of the different learning support teams. So that included class, the Mass Learning Centre, and the librarians. And we started to think, okay, how are we going to define critical thinking? What are the skills that we think students need to learn, and how can we support students with that? We quickly realised we can't cover everything from the first go. So we decided to focus on confirmation bias, source evaluation, so that reliability and authority, critical reading and critical writing. Because these were skills that we felt either having more online support, self-directed support would be beneficial, or areas where we needed to do some development ourselves. So things like confirmation bias and that source evaluation, where we didn't have a lot of material on this already. So we felt that that would be beneficial to develop that. But also these different topics all lend themselves very well to academic work. And whilst I would like to, be able to talk to students about those skills and applying these skills outside of academic work, we're also aware that students are often thinking very practically about that next assignment and how will this help me with my next assignment. So we felt that these topics lent themselves very well to helping students with the skills that they need in academic work as well as in life. We're now going to go on to demonstrate a few of the different sections in this toolkit and the approach that we're taking to teaching these skills. So we're going to give you a chance to experience some of these tasks that we set students. So what I'd like you to do, we're just going to put the links in the chat, but you should be able to click on them on the slides as well. So what I want you to do is take 5 minutes to compare 2 websites. And I want you to think about whether either of these websites are reliable sources of information on bullying, its causes and means of prevention. So I'm not asking you whether you think they should be used in an assignment. These are not necessarily academic sources of information. I'm not asking that, but just if you were a concerned parent, for example, and just doing a bit of a Google search and you came across these websites, do you think they are reliable sources of information? So this is the second question on that MS Forms. So if you've still got that MS Forms open, then you can just move on to the second question. If you haven't, we'll put the link again in the chat, so that's easy for you to get. And we'll spend about 5 minutes having a look at this. So we've got just another couple of minutes, and please do make sure that you've submitted your answers onto the MS Forms, just so we can see the general spread of answers. Okay. So we've got some results in. Seems the majority of people think that both are unreliable. Some people think that they're both reliable. And one person thinks that the first website, so the American College of Pediatricians website, is the more reliable one. So generally you're thinking that both are unreliable. Now, when I do this this question with students in workshops, I tend to get a bit of a mixture. I tend to get kind of similar in that they might think, oh, they're both unreliable, or they're both reliable, or they think that the first one, again, that American College of Pediatricians, is the most reliable. What if I was to tell you that that first website, that organization is actually a splinter organization from the main Pediatrics Association in America, and they are classed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center because of the statements that they've made and their stance towards LGBT people. They have also been accused of misrepresenting other people's research. So that list of references at the end becomes suspect once we know this, because they have this reputation of misrepresenting evidence. So even that list of references then becomes something that we need to take into account. And once we know of their anti-LGBT stance, they advocate for things like conversion therapy, etc. Then you go in, and what I normally do with students, we're not going to do this today because of time constraints, but what I normally do with students is we then go back and we look at that website with this new information in mind, and then you can immediately start to see that some of the things that they are either recommending or recommending against, they say that current anti-bullying programs are not appropriate because they could, in effect, what they're saying is that they could cause students to be gay. And they could confirm this in students by just talking to students about these issues. And so the advice that they're given is very clearly influenced by their political views. That's not obvious just by reading that website unless you go and do some research about it and you find out a bit more about the organisation. But this is not generally things that people are doing when they look at a website. They take it at face value. And this can lead to issues such as we see with this website. Also, the second website, that is a website that is hosted by the main Pediatrics Association in America. The person who's written it is an academic researcher. She's kind of head of pediatrics division at University of Wisconsin-Madison, I think it is, and she is also the head of a social media and adolescent mental health research unit. So when it comes to writing about cyberbullying, she's definitely an authority on that issue. So in terms of comparing both of these websites, actually the second one is the more reliable of the two. But that's not necessarily immediately obvious. So I talked to students about this issue when using websites, about how evaluating reliability and authority is not always straightforward, not always easy, and that you need to go and do what's known as lateral reading, this process of doing research about an organisation by moving away from those websites. This is one of the exercises that we ask students to do as part of the critical thinking toolkit. So this was the main the initial outcome of the critical thinking project was the creation of an online toolkit. This is made using Articulate Rise software, which allows it to be interactive. So we have various different activities throughout the toolkit that allow students to put into practice what we're teaching them, because that's really important. It's not enough to just tell someone this is what you should be doing. They need a chance to actually practice it, because these are skills that have to be developed. So Articulate Rise is really useful for doing that. And like I said, we have modules on confirmation bias, evaluating information, and then critical reading and critical writing. And these are designed holistically, so they're designed to lead on from one to another, although students can dip in and out and choose which modules they're most interested in at that moment in time as well. So I'm just going to hand over to Arena.
as Anna suggested, the class team focused on the last two main lessons of the toolkit, critical reading and writing, and we try to adopt a scaffolding approach, targeting the level of information at entry-level students, but also taking into account the fact that more advanced students may choose to simply jump to a specific lesson. For example, in the critical reading unit, students can go through the introduction, which simply explains to them what we mean by reading a text actively with the purpose of identifying evidence you can use in an assignment or in order to back up your argument. Then we explore strategies of reading, so from skimming to close reading, also reading different types of academic sources, from academic books to journal articles. Then we move on towards the idea of putting information together into themes, identifying the main argument of a text and grouping those kind of different arguments under a specific point or theme. We have examples of note making, and again, students have the opportunity to try out making notes, and finally move on towards bringing all those themes into providing synthesis and overview of evidence from a range of sources and building their own argument based on that. As Anna suggested, we try to have a kind of coherent approach by looking at a specific overall topic, which is related to climate change. Then in the critical writing unit, we try to again kind of reiterate some of the points we made in the critical reading lesson in case somebody jumps straight into that. That is features of criticality, and then we move from simply offering students some pointers in identifying critical writing in the work of others, or even looking at their own work with these lenses. Then we move on towards particular strategies of developing a critical paragraph, and the final lesson invites them to try out their hand at producing a critical paragraph using sources that we have provided as part of the toolkit. So just going to give you the opportunity to explore one of these lessons, which is the initial lesson in the critical writing unit. If you can have a look, Anna has placed the link in the chat box, and consider what aspects of this lesson would you consider using perhaps with a specific cohort you're working on. Do you consider it to be more appropriate, for example, for, I don't know, year one students, or a specific cohort that you're currently engaging with? Would you make any changes? What sort of changes would you make in order to make it more relevant to your students? And any feedback, comments and suggestions, please add them to the chat box. So again, we'll take maybe 5 minutes for you to have a chance to explore the toolkit and you know, just see the different types of interactions that students can be exposed to. Yeah, thank you for your comment. So kind of being able to identify the difference between descriptive and critical writing. We did try to include entry-level students. In the toolkit is meant to help with kind of introducing students to this idea of critical thinking. And we did try to provide in every unit some sort of introduction. Ideally, we want students to go through all of it, but as Anna said, we do realize it might not be something that they might want to do. So they might just jump to a specific lesson. Oh, thank you.
It's good to kind of if I look back at those that first question we asked about, you know, what aspects of critical thinking do you think that would be most important for your students to develop, and it's kind of good to look at that and think that yes, all of those different aspects are included in the toolkit. So we have correctly identified when we were creating the toolkit the skills that we think students do need. So well, yeah, sorry, go on, Irina.
No, I'm just going to pick up the next comment. So thank you for your comment. You're saying, I'm wondering how this will be implemented or introduced to students. What we have tried to do so far, as Anna mentioned, we promoted as part of our workshops, as self-selecting workshops, as well as part of our faculty sessions. But we have also offered it to, so one of the ways in which we're trying to promote it is this session today. This can be integrated in the Blackboard module as a learning object. So if anybody's interested in finding out how they can do that, please let us know. Anna or I would be very happy to comment on that. Yeah.
So we want to talk about the open program workshops and the feedback as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Just because I'm aware we might need time for questions, so I want to make sure that we've got some time for.
So just we only have a couple of slides left, and just really to focus on the feedback we have received so far on our workshops, which focus on the idea of critical thinking. So in particular, in November, we offered the full range of workshops focusing on all these various aspects, all the various components of the toolkit, from confirmation bias to evaluating information, as well as the kind of more traditional workshops we were offering on critical writing. And of those students who left feedback through our kind of common LLS survey, 90% rated the sessions as good or excellent. We also have some sample qualitative comments, and we pick this because so in addition to students, quite often they express their they say thank you, or they express the fact that they felt a particular workshop was useful. This particular comment kind of highlight more clearly what the students picked up from the session, and they also use some of the terminology that the tutors would have discussed. So I thought that is particularly interesting. The first comment, which was provided for the confirmation bias workshop, the student suggested that she understood the definition of critical thinking and what it involves. So I thought that's quite good. The second comment refers to a particular model or a way of looking at writing that we suggest in the class team, trying to identify between the three types of voices in your writing, and in particular the critical and the descriptive voice. And I have a very nice comment on a tutorial which finishes in the words "more power." So I thought that's really encouraging. And again, highlighting what we consider to be really important, the idea of confidence, because of course students would be, as I said at the beginning, they'll be familiar with the fact that they need to demonstrate criticality in their writing, but they often are not confident that they are able to do that. So I think boosting confidence is really quite important. And finally, a comment on the workshop critically evaluating sources of information, which mentions the concept of lateral reading. And I was kind of mentioning this earlier. So clearly a particular abstract concept that students has taken over, has remembered from the workshop, and feels she's able to apply to her assignment writing, planning and writing her assignments. And again, she mentions confidence boosting, which again, we think that it's quite important. So thank you very much for your comment. I'm just gonna pass this back to Anna so she can briefly talk about plans for the future while I'm scrolling through the comment.
Yeah, so thank you for all your comments. It's really encouraging to know that you think that this will be useful, that you're going to signpost this to your students. Some of you have asked about how you can, can you embed this in curriculum? So as Irina said, yes, please do signpost students to it on Blackboard. You can link to it in Blackboard. You can link to individual modules in it. I don't think you can necessarily link to like a specific activity necessarily. It kind of takes you through to the top level section that activity occurs in, but then by doing that, students would get more context and the guidance that we're providing. So just bear that in mind. If you're uncertain, well, which sections should I, where should I put the link? Which section should I put a link to? Just drop us a message on Teams or an email, and we can advise on that. It is something that we are looking to keep up to date, and it's not going to be a static resource. So I'm hoping that we might be able to kind of maybe add some more information in about interpreting statistics and data, and maybe some other logical fallacies and cognitive biases. So at the moment it's just confirmation bias, but it would be good, I think, if we could expand that section a little bit. You're also very welcome to get in contact with us if you would like us to run workshops in your curriculum. Again, I think it's really important that we have the online toolkits so that students can work through this in their own time as well. But we know that often students prefer to have someone explain a topic in more depth face to face. And so if you think workshops on any of these topics would be beneficial in your in curriculum work, then please do get in contact with us and we'll be happy to offer these.